All right, my dudes, what's happening? Welcome to the Heroes Lecture Part 2, version 3. Yeah, version 3. And this is, I think, going to be a 4-part series, at least a 3-part. Maybe I can condense it to 4, but we'll see. And in the last lecture, we talked about this strange phenomenon called the hero story, the hero's narrative. It was popularized by Joseph Campbell, where he did a survey of numerous cultures, and he found that there is a consistent narrative pattern that runs through all of them for all time, including our own, and maybe even especially our own. This isn't just some ancient faraway thing or something that happens in some tiny tribe in Uganda. This happens in the United States, in the developed country, and it happens all the time. This hero's lecture, this is the story essentially of one person saving the world, saving their people. And so it's like Joseph Campbell called it the monomyth. And the idea is kind of like, okay, well, this story seems to exist across all cultures, across all time. Well, then maybe it's somehow this is the story of us. Maybe the universe itself is a story. Its shape is a story. That we most profitably perceive it as a story. And what does a story do? It tells us what the world is, right? It's contextualizing. This is the world. This is us. This is how we should move through the world. That's what stories do. Sometimes they're for entertainment. There's a lot of uses for stories, but probably the highest use is telling us how we can adapt to the world, right? Now, in some ways you could say we've taken like sort of this top-down approach. We've done this sort of loose, quasi-scientific survey, right? Campbell was this voracious consumer of media, and he put together like probably hundreds of thousands of different mythologies to create his case, but it's kind of like, okay, so we all tell the story. I don't know if I'm ready to buy that this is kind of like the shape of the universe. I mean, like, it's a bit of a jump, don't you think? And it's like, yeah, I know, I hear you. And so it's like, well, why don't we look at it from a different perspective? Because when we're talking about the hero story, as I said, these are, this is something that helps us to contextualize, orient ourselves within the world, which means that it helps us adapt to the world, presumably, right? And so right, a narrative tells us, right, it's an adaptive, an orienting vehicle. And so, if I'm going to make all these claims like, oh, this is the shape of the universe, this is who we truly are, it's like, well, enough of this, pseudo-scientific this woo-woo sort of new age analysis. Like, where is it in the language of science? Like, how do we see this in the religion of today, which is basically like, scientists are our priests now. They're the ones who connect us to the deep truths of the world, in a sense. And then, like, our intuition and all that other stuff is just a bunch of psychobabble. Well, we could think about, like, well, why narrative? Why would I say narrative is the shape of the universe? Well, what exactly is a narrative, Stephen? What the hell is it? What's a story? Certainly we all tell stories. I mean, I don't think we can argue about that. I mean, everyone tells a story, and probably everyone for all time has told stories. Probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years back, we were telling stories. And then you go, well, what exactly is a story? Can we analyze a story from a more of a ground-up perspective, from within our biology, from within our physiology? And what I would say is that stories are inherently woven into our physiology. And I mean that as technically as possible, that narratives are absolutely a fundamental, essential part of our very biology. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a step back. I mean, again, if it's part of our physiology, then that means it's essential to our survival. That's what I'm talking about. And so if you think about how we're comprised, right, we are arranged essentially in 2 parts. You could say it's our thinking brain, our voluntary systems, and our involuntary systems. We have this animal instinctual side, and then we have this reflective conscientious side. Maybe the seed of consciousness sits within this thing called the prefrontal cortex. I mean, you could say it sits within our brain, but there's hypothalamus, the amygdala, these more involuntary aspects of our brain, that it's hard to consciously access them. But the prefrontal certainly is where we consciously think. And actually, it's more developed in humans, certainly proportionally, by far than any other living organism. So we have this special prefrontal cortex, and we have this part of our prefrontal cortex called the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it is they call it a flexible rule setting device. Now, think about this. So we have these two parts, right? We have sort of the animal side, like I'm hungry, I want to have sex, or even like your favorite color, right? These instincts rise up within us. It's kind of the part that we're born with. And then we have this thinking part that's able to analyze and to reflect and then to help us grow. And then you could say the person that's most well adapted is a person that's able to combine these two elements in the most harmonious or well adapted way possible that allows them to move forward like prosperously into the future. So an example is someone that does not have this combination put together well will be someone that like is unable to control their temper. You know, every time something doesn't go well, they just throw a tantrum. You can imagine like an adult acting like a 2-year-old. I mean, basically a 2-year-old is an example of someone with an underdeveloped prefrontal. They're not able to orchestrate their prefrontal with their base instincts, and so they're largely helpless. They can't prosperously advance into the future within society, within their own peers, because they're just unable to put these two things together. I mean, you know, in the case of the 2-year-olds, they don't really have a prefrontal yet. They do, but it's underdeveloped. So if we're talking about, I mean, essentially what we're talking about is how to adapt, right? My theory, my idea behind the hero's narrative is like, this is the story that helps us move into the future. And so it's like, how do we as humans move forward into the future? It's all about this combination of your instincts and then your thinking brain. You can't just have your thinking brain. I mean, it's tempting to think that if I just I can analyze my way through life. Well, it's like, well, how do you even know what you want without, like, how do you determine your preferences? Well, the answer is you don't think of your preferences, you discover them. You kind of listen, you engage in this weird conversation with whatever this is, and you're like, yeah, my favorite color is kind of like, I think it's purple. Like, almost like a black hunting cat, you know, like a black jaguar, that black purple, like, I think that's my favorite color. But again, I'm not sure, you know, I'm kind of like engaging in this conversation. And so like, yeah, the degree to which you're able to harness these instincts, your desires, your impulses, like, oh, I'm hungry. And then your prefrontal says, well, do you need to eat now, or can you wait until 2:00 and finish your work now, so that, you know what I mean? Like, your ability to sublimate your desires, your ability to sacrifice the present for the future is all about this dance between your prefrontal and then the rest of your body, the rest of your systems, your involuntary systems. And then, you know, like, delaying gratification is one of the key factors of success. We've all heard these stories. So anyways, it's like, okay, well then the question is, how does the prefrontal orchestrate and connect with the rest of your systems? And the answer is through story. Like, technically, like, literally, specifically, we cannot survive without stories. You cannot coordinate your system without telling yourself a story. It's pretty wild. Now, I said before that your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a flexible rule-setting device. That is the most basic way of describing what that, I think it's here, it's somewhere around here, of what that does. Like, your left dorsolateral is in this great position to make decisions because it has something called the insula and the ACC, which connects to your autonomic, your heart rate, your lungs, your gut. Like, it's so interesting when you start studying your neurology, because you realize that, like, I just take for granted that I know how fast my heart is beating. You know, like, especially when it's beating hard, you can hear it. It's like, it's a sensation. But like you only know that because there are sensors like tied to that. You like it's so interesting. Your body is not the knowledge of your body is not a given. There's so much about yourself that you don't understand. You're this community and this mystery at the same time. So anyways, like your left dorsal lateral, the way it communicates with that system is by setting up rules. It's a rule setting device. That's how it regulates. That's how it regulates it. So that's why it's like, oh, I want that car is really beautiful. I want that car. Well, the prefrontal goes, well, you can't just go over there and like kill that person and then take their car. Like, it sets up the contextual, it sets up the context of the world. Now, a flexible rule setting device, you could think of it from a very simple perspective. So they did this experiment called the Stroop test. And the Stroop test, what they did is they gave people very, very simple rules to follow, and then they observed them as they changed the rules. So like they have these flashcards. Okay, I want you to read the flashcards, like tree, house, butterfly, flower, bucket, whatever. And they're reading it, right? And then, they kind of measure their speed. And then they go, okay, wait a second. Now, instead of reading the words, I want you to tell me the color of the flashcards. And then they go like, there's usually some kind of pause. And then they go pink, blue, red, and then they're off to the races. But now that pause is interesting because what's happening is your prefrontal, your dorsal lateral, is recontextualizing your system in order to follow a different rule set. It's a flexible rule setting structure, right? Now, when it does that, incidentally, or actually, this is sort of an interesting point. When it starts changing that rule set, what it does is it actually sends a calming signal to your body. And you enter in kind of this meditative phase where you go, okay, you start analyzing. You have to reanalyze the world in a sense. You're reanalyzing the cards now, and you're going, okay, well, now my goal is, now like the story is, I have to say the color, not the word that's on the card, right? It's a different rule set. Now, if you were to extrapolate that, right, a flexible rule setting device, well, what is the world? Well, the world is kind of a collection of rules, isn't it? It's a collection of aspects and contours and limitations and shapes and colors. It's kind of like an obstacle course, or it's like this game that's been set up with basically millions upon millions of tiny little rules that we all have to live within. And then each of us has a different conception of those rules. So our conception of the world is probably just a very complex system of rules, right? The left dorsal lateral can somehow do this. And then you could think of yourself as well as kind of this collection of, it is sort of a collection of rules, right? We have these physiological limitations. We have these preferences, these rules for what we like, or like your favorite color. That's kind of like a rule. And so we're constantly trying to update and improve our conceptualization of the world and of ourselves, right? This is how this dorsal lateral, this is how we coordinate our voluntary systems with the involuntary in order to, again, be properly adapted to the world, to move prosperously into the world. You could think of an example of like a ballet dancer. A ballet dancer is someone who you could say has a very well adapted concept of the world and their bodies and how their bodies move through the world. That they've deeply understand the limitations of their physiology within the confines of the way that the world is organized, right? The laws of physics and probably just mostly the laws of physics, right? How you can basically contend with gravity and the internal structural integrity of your own body, especially when they stand up on that one little square centimeter or millimeter of their toe and they're doing this and they're rotating in circles and then they're leaping off. It's like, how the hell can you even do that? And they probably have all these calluses and, they develop this hardened physiology in order for them to perform, but they've mastered the conception, the limitations of their body within the confines of the world, and now they're able to harmonize, right? Achieve shapes and motions and, dynamic physical compositions that instinctually we somehow find pleasing, and then we all applaud them, and they have somehow achieved right. So that's an example of how our conscious physiology interacts with our involuntary, unconscious physiology, right? The heart rate, the lungs, all these stuff that we kind of don't quite control, but we have some influence over, I guess. And the way that it does that is through narratives, through stories, this flexible rule-setting device. So we could think of a really simple example. Why don't we take a look at this guy? So why don't we start up this thing here? Okay. Pretend that you're in a restaurant. Okay, this is a really simple example. Let's go through this quickly. Pretend that you're in a restaurant. I don't care what restaurant it is. And you sit down and you see this menu. I'll show you this menu. So you're sitting down, let's say you're really hungry, you're sitting down for dinner, whatever it is, and you're looking through this menu, right? And what do? Usually when you sit down, like when I sit down, I go, what am I in the mood for? Like I actually start this really, like when you think about this really weird conversation with myself. What am I in the mood for? Like I don't really know what it is. I'm like, And then usually what happens is, I'm just going to look through this right now, like, I'm probably not going to do the burger. It's kind of rich. Now this Eastern Shore crab cake could be interesting. So right, I'm ruling out things instinctually. I'm receiving signals from my involuntary, right? My instincts, and then my thinking brain is going, okay, let's look at this. We're going to analyze this. This is what's calling out to me. And my immediate thought is actually like, usually these crab cakes are too salty. Like that's just, I don't know, that's what I'm thinking. So what's happening is that there's this coordinated dance or conversation that's happening between these two systems. And what the instinctual system did is it called out to this Eastern Shore crab cake. And my prefrontal started spinning up this sort of scenario. Like I imagined myself eating it. I imagined the flavor. But then I tapped into my hippocampus, right? This left dorsolateral has access to multiple sources of data, so it's going to access my hippocampus, which is my memory, and I'm like, yeah, I remember when I had crab cakes before, like it's usually pretty salty, and so like I'm trying to reduce my prediction error. Like these are all, I'm trying to model out the world, and the unanalyzed raw instinct was, oh, crab cake's going to be really tasty, and then my prefrontal's like, no, that narrative's not correct. That model of the world I don't think is quite correct, because I remember having crab cakes at multiple restaurants and it's always too fucking salty. It's too goddamn salty. And so then my instinct is like, oh shit, okay. So then I have to spin that narrative down. It's like a series of very simple stories. And then I'm like, okay, buttermilk fried chicken sandwich. That sounds fucking good. It's a free range, hormone, whatever. I don't care about hormone free, right? So now I'm analyzing my instinct. I'm analyzing, okay, what's the situation here? How do I feel about pimento cheese spread? I'm actually kind of a little bit wary. I have some anxiety surrounding pimento cheese spread because I don't know what the fuck that is. And it sounds, again, kind of salty and kind of maybe a little too sour, right? So what am I doing? I'm trying to construct the world. I'm trying to say, okay, I'm trying to model out how this fried chicken sandwich that they made here is going to taste. Now, I like the idea of fried chicken. That's just the basic instinct, or the base. That movie's just too weird. Basic instinct. The base instinct is just fried chicken, especially buttermilk fried chicken. Buttermilk. Who doesn't like buttermilk? But then I'm like, this pimento cheese spread, and also like, it looks kind of rich, and also I'm trying to go low gluten, right? The prefrontal, this is the dance. I'm adding in new pieces of data, to construct myself, right? I'm trying to go gluten-free. It might be too rich. I might regret eating this sandwich even if it tastes good. I'm trying to normalize out the total amount of reward that I will reap over a longer period of time. Not just when I'm eating it, but let's say the few hours after, how it'll affect me, right? I'm trying to maximize that reward, the most amount of reward collected over a longer series of time. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to model out the future. This is a very predictive element. And so this is how these two things come together. Now, what's interesting too is that as I'm engaging in this rule setting exercise, right? I'm just trying to figure out what the right rules are. I'm building this world. I'm contextualizing the world. I'm also building my future self. I'm telling a story. I mean, that's a story, right? And then I'm modeling out what it's like for me to eat the sandwich, and then I went another step to think about, well, what will I feel maybe a few hours after I eat the sandwich? Because that might reduce my reward in like such that it'll actually eliminate it'll like more than offset in a negative way the pleasure of eating the sandwich. And let's say you're trying to lose weight, you even model out the time or extend your time horizon even further and go, well, that's going to make me fat and I'm going to regret whatever pleasure I had eating the sandwich, which is a really tough it's a tough negotiation to have with yourself, man, because that sandwich might taste pretty good. Anyway, so this is a simple but really pretty good example of how these two systems connect. And they connect through shapes and colors and sensations and analysis and details, all to set up a predictive model that will hopefully reap for you the highest reward possible over the longest period of time. Hopefully over the longest period of time. I mean, some of you might be really impulsive and you're just like, I just want the tastiest thing possible. I don't care what the future is after that. I just want a tasty ass sandwich, man. Right? And that is a type of conversation you can have. And maybe you might say that person, if that's how that person behaves in every aspect of their lives, probably they're not going to be very well adapted to the future, because you probably need to model out a little further than just the consumption of the sandwich itself, or whatever it is that you're trying to acquire. You need to evaluate that more than just how it makes you feel in the moment, or its immediate impact in the moment. Like, I'm going to do that career, but you don't think about what it'll be like to do that career for the next 10 years of your life or something like that. That's an example. So then what are stories? Well, stories are an essential vehicle. Stories are the way in which our voluntary and involuntary systems coordinate. We could not coordinate ourselves without a story. It's absolutely a biological necessity. It's a survival impulse. Narratives are biological survival impulse. It's the impulse to adapt. They're exploratory simulations in order to determine and acquire the best possible outcome for the future. It's a way to secure the future. That's what stories are, So as a side note, basically the struggle often is how to coordinate these systems, because the instinctual system is very powerful. And when you encounter, let's say, unexpected or anxiety-provoking situations, let's say situations at work where your boss yells at you, or you feel like someone sent you kind of a disrespectful email, or you're on Twitter, God forbid, you can have these responses where you just become enraged, right? You could call that a very high autonomic arousal state. And so the stories that sort of arise from these very basic emotions, right? Think 2-year-old, tantrum, flopping down on the ground, on the floor, just, pounding the pavement or whatever, pounding the floor in rage. It's like they're very non-sophisticated, you could say non-differentiating responses to different situations that happen. Again, the world emerges to us, right? The world is constantly emerging to us and is constantly changing before us, and we have to respond to these changes. And often it's the instinctual side that responds first. So you become enraged, you just have bad temper, like, oh, you read this email. And then if you respond within that rage, probably what your response will do is it'll make the situation worse, because it's a non-contextualizing sort of a general emotion, and usually it's disproportionate. Think road rage. Someone just cut you off. I mean, you didn't. No one threatened your life, like, or someone's waiting. They're not accelerating fast enough at a green light. Like they don't. Light turns green. They haven't. They're not going yet. They're not. They're not moving forward, and it's like they're still stopped at a green light. You get enraged. Why? Like your life isn't threatened. Like no one's attacking your family. No one's robbed your bank account. You know what I mean? So then your prefrontal has to try to spin up different narratives. It tries to calm your instinctual systems. There's this kind of battle that happens between your emotional side and your thinking side. And basically, like, if you can stand still for long enough, right? You can just sit with that rage long enough and try not to enact this narrative that the rage is implying. I guess emotions are kind of like narratives. Like stories are just everywhere. Maybe you get out of your car and you start yelling at the guy and he pulls out a gun and he shoots you. You know what I mean? Like if you try to just sit with it, what'll happen is your prefrontal will start to send a calming signal down via the vagus nerve to slow your heart rate and calm your breathing, and then sort of settle your digestion, because you can get a little bit worked up in your gut when you're angry, and it'll start to spin up different contexts, and you go, well, whatever, it's not that big a deal, it's only a couple extra seconds that they delayed, at this green light, whatever, maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they're just on, you spin up these alternative narratives, you try to recontextualize the world so that you don't have this rage response, or you try to contextualize the rage response. So that, I guess that's kind of a side note. That's why patience is such an important virtue, because you need to give that's a biological basis for patience, because you have to give your prefrontal time to like send that calming signal. You need to sort of calm the rest of your body, because eventually that rage subsides, and then you can start to think clearly and have because the prefrontal is massively differentiating. It's super differentiating. It's capable of teasing out all kinds of subtlety. I mean, think of the number of colors you can see. Like I remember when I was growing up, like we only had 256 colors like on the monitor. Now it's like 42,000 or something, some absurd number of colors that you can actually distinguish. It's remarkable. And a lot of that's achieved, through that prefrontal. So, and that goes for the type of emotional responses and the type of context you can be in. Like, the way you behave in a classroom is different than the way you behave in a party, which would be different the way you might behave in a courtroom. That's your prefrontal able to contextualize different narratives. Each of those settings are like the settings of a movie. The world appears to us, it emerges to us as a story, essentially, because stories are nothing more than multiple and numerous complex rule sets interacting with each other, right? You have the rules, you have physics going on, you got some chemistry happening in the world, right? But then you have sociological implications, right? Social customs, social norms, how well you can get along, right? How complex societies and their rule sets, all these things are coming together, but you're able to somehow curate and isolate and put together, build a world that's relevant to your future self moving through that world, right? So again, like, well, Steve, what really is a story? I mean, come on, none of this new age shit. Well, sorry, brother, but I'm telling you, brother, like stories are absolutely biologically necessary. They're woven into our physiology. It's how our systems coordinate. That's how important they are. So the voluntary system, the involuntary system is what forms the basis of motivations. Like it's where our desires come from, and then the prefrontal is sort of how it contextualizes, sorts it out, prioritizes, and then enables you to move forward to acquire those desires, to reap the reward of that desire, more or less. And then if we're talking about movement, if we're talking about advancing towards acquisition of a reward, whether that's I want this fancy car, I want this hot woman, I want to eat this awesome meal, I want popularity, fame, all these different things that we go after, right? I want to help people, whatever. That's like, that's movement towards a valued goal. That's movement. So let's go into a few quotes here. Let's take a look at this guy. So this is a nice quote that kind of talks about our survival strategy. This is how our species move forward. The purpose of thinking is to let the ideas die instead of us dying, right? We spin up simulative narratives. In the example of the road rage, it's like that guy is stopped at a green light. You know, you could potentially, in your rage narrative, go and enact this rageful self. It's almost like the rage itself is a narrative. And you get out of your car, right? And then you yell at the guy, and he happens to be this ex-Navy SEAL who's, you know, like, who's currently experiencing PTSD, and suddenly you take him back to the time where he was in Iraq, you know, and then he pulls out like a Magnum 45 or a caliber and just shoots you in the head. And it's like, okay, you run that scenario, that exploratory simulation. You go, okay, I'm not going to do that because I could be shot in the head. And then instead you go, oh, okay, well, I'll just wait until he's ready to go. You know? You let your thoughts, your ideas die instead of you dying. And then one way to think of that is like, well, mosquitoes have a very different survival impulse. How do they adapt to this world that's constantly emerging and changing before us? Well, they lay like 1 million eggs. And then they all of them are a little bit different, right? The genes, there's some variation in each of their genes, and they all hatch, and then like 999,990 of them die, and then 10 of them happen to survive, and they move forward into the future. Well, instead of laying eggs, you know, we just spin up narratives. We spin up future selves, right? Future identities. Even in the case of the restaurant, this is the identity of me eating the chicken sandwich. This is the identity of me eating the burger. You know, how does this character play out? What's this identity like? What's this person like? It's not a very deep identity because once you finish the burger, I mean, the narrative's over, and there's not a lot of consequences on whether you choose the chicken sandwich. Like, your mom's not going to start crying if you choose the burger instead of the chicken sandwich. I mean, probably not. You know, unless, you know, you're diabetic or something and you shouldn't be eating that. But basically, these narratives are alternate identities, alternate futures that you spin up, and you have to evaluate each one of them, and the degree to which you are successful is the degree to which you are accurate in your prediction. Your ability to properly contextualize the possible outcomes in the world and how they might affect you and how you'll feel about those outcomes. These are all predictive. Determines your success in the world, right? So it's basically how well you can tell a story, essentially. The accuracy of your narrative, right? These narratives are so fundamental to who we are. So going back to this PowerPoint, right? The purpose of thinking is to let the ideas die instead of us dying. So we kind of went through that. Now, when we're talking about narratives, we're essentially talking about motivations, right? In the case of the restaurant, we sat down, we spun up these narratives so that we could try to pick the best menu item that would secure for us the best reward as measured over the longest period of time, essentially. The most relevant period of time, which, you know, you're in charge of determining that. There's only one currency in all of reality, and that's dopamine. Now, when we're talking about motivations, right, and outcomes, you could think of that, it's kind of like movement, right? The goal is to secure the best outcome. Which menu item do we choose, right? That's kind of like movement. How do we move towards that goal? Well, we have to select the right menu item. And the reason why I keep saying movement is because dopamine, we often think of dopamine as this internal reward system, right? It's this thing that makes us feel good, and that's true. Dopamine is a large part of our sense of well-being. Without dopamine, if we had like zero dopamine, we could not feel good. Huberman tells a story about when he got really sick, like he had all this diarrhea, whatever. His stomach was in turmoil, and they shot him up with this substance that would kind of bind up his GI, and immediately he started crying. He just started weeping. He was really depressed. He was just the future looked bleak. He was really down on life, and suddenly he was just like, wait, what the hell just happened? Like, I think it was the injection. What did you inject me with? And it was some chemical that blocked his dopamine receptors. And so he wasn't getting any dopamine. He was just a complete mess. And then he was like, just give me the thing that will reverse that. And they shot him up with that. And then like 5 minutes later, he was totally fine again. He was like, oh my God, that was crazy. So dopamine absolutely is essential to our sense of well-being. But what you probably didn't know is that without dopamine, you can't move. Literally, without dopamine, you are incapable of physically moving. And that's interesting because when you think about what is the most basic expression of motivation, the most basic expression of a narrative, it's movement. Why would you, whenever you move, it requires an investment of energy, an expenditure of energy. Energy is valuable. There's a limited supply. And the less energy that we have available to us, the lower our chances of survival. The lower our potential for executing the things that we need to do in order to move prosperously into the future. And so dopamine, not only is it just the key molecule in our motivational systems, it's so fundamental to motivation that without it, you can't even physically move. I mean, part of that is that dopamine is upstream of energy, like pure energy, both neural energy and then physical energy. So that would be adrenaline and then epinephrine. Without epinephrine, we can't power the synapses to like power our thoughts. So dopamine is this key molecule, and again in this awesome quote, there's only one currency in all of reality, and that's dopamine. What does he mean by that? You could think of currency as sort of this physicalized reward. It's kind of this symbolic reward. I mean, in dollars, and he says Bitcoin, dollars, all these different currencies, they're sort of this reward that we try to get that represents potential. But even the acquisition of this money is dopaminergically mediated, meaning our motivation to acquire different levels of money, whether it's pesos, yen, dollars, Bitcoin, whatever the hell it is, our motivation is determined by the dopaminergic value that we assign to those dollars. So it's not really the dollars that incentivize us, it's the dopamine that we associate. It's the dopaminergic, the internal dopaminergic representation of that money that motivates us. And so if you have money stored up, he says dopamine regulates our sense of power, our power potential, our security, right? Certainly the sense of well-being, but it's like if you have a bunch of food stored up or a bunch of money in your bank account, the degree to which you feel a sense of confidence and well-being and security from that is the degree to which how much dopamine you associate with that amount of money. Now, everyone will have a different level of dopamine for different amounts of money. If you have $1 million, some people are going to have this giant stack of dopamine, assigned to that amount of money. If you're like Ray Dalio and you're like a billionaire, maybe $1 million is kind of like, it's good, but it's not like the best thing ever, right? He has sort of a low dopaminergic internal value assigned to that amount of money. So yeah, it's kind of this weird way of looking at it. Like, what we want isn't really what we want. What we want is only what we want insofar as we attach dopamine to that thing. And then when we're talking about our involuntary systems, right? Like, what's your favorite color? You don't like derive that. You just try to feel that, right? You just try to discover what that is, and then you report it. You try to interpret the signals, and you report, I think it's aquamarine. I'm pretty sure it's aquamarine. The amount of dopamine that you associate with different things is kind of, it's somewhat out of your control. I mean, some of it can be influenced by your understanding. Like, if you like this person because they're really good looking, but then you learn that their personality kind of sucks, then because of your understanding, the new information that you acquired, your updating of the world, right? This is your build out of the world. Your dopamine value might drop. But there's sort of a basic, I guess, preset palette or context, preset hierarchy of preferences that you're born with, that where you assign dopamine to. So let's talk about this idea of, let's go back to that restaurant example and how on this menu each of those items offer different types of rewards and based on the preference of the person. Now, there have been studies done, of course there's studies done about not just the preferences of different people, but the preferences of humans, the preferences of people, not just like individuals, but like all people. And there are certain types of motivations that most people tend to prioritize. So one of the most famous ones, I mean, what is one motivation that is pretty powerful that all of us are kind of enslaved to? I mean, like sex. I mean, like basically sex. I mean, there's so many internal incentivizations to have sex, and it's almost like we're being like steered like cattle towards it, right? Because this instinctual system, this involuntary system, wants to procreate. That there's an inherent value and proclivity that that the system is not just that it wants to procreate, like it assigns a high dopaminergic value to the acquisition of a mate and then the securing of the procreation and the subsequent production of offspring or whatever, having kids essentially. That we've evolved to reality is such that we're all a bunch of horny bastards. Like sexual motivation is highly positively reinforcing. So that has a certain dopaminergic value, and that'll vary from person to person, but it's probably in the top 3 or top 5 motivations that drive us, right? So that kind of implies a narrative. So we're talking about these instinctual narratives, right? And then you could say, okay, well, what are some of the highest motivations? Certainly starting a family, that there's a lot of motivations in there. Some of it is certainly the propagation of the species, the survival of the species. We continue to move into the future with this offspring, but also there's like a lot of other rewards with there too. It's the giving and receiving of love. It's the admiration that you'll get from other people, right? That people will be grateful that you have kids. There's a sense that you're helping society, you're making the world a better place by providing more people in the world. There's a lot of different motivations, rewards tied into that. So love is a motivation. Sex is a motivation. There's certain intrinsic pleasureful things that are motivations, like alcohol and intoxication, certainly like cocaine, things like that. All of these provide different kinds of, you could say, reinforcing stimuli that motivates you to perform certain behaviors. So like the sexual stimuli will motivate you to maybe take more showers or get a certain haircut or go out to spend money and get better clothes, right? That's the sexual motivation at work, and it's extremely powerful. And you might say it's the top. Maybe you might think maybe that's the most powerful, single most powerful motivation. Just an example. But they did this experiment in the 60s, okay, where they're able to. These guys I don't know how they do this, but they're able to, I guess, kind of stimulate different parts of the brain that, that emulate certain kinds of stimuli. Like they're able to tickle certain parts of the brain. So they could tickle the sexual stimuli part, the intoxicated part, the whatever it is, love, all these different parts. And they were trying to figure out, okay, what's the most positively reinforcing stimuli? You could say, what's the most positively, most powerful motivation, right? The most powerful narrative. Is having sex the most powerful narrative? Is getting drunk the most, And actually, what they found to be the most powerful, which is kind of interesting. Um, it's something called exploratory, voluntary, exploratory, voluntary exploratory positive reward, or you could say voluntary exploration towards fear stimuli. So they had this experiment with rats where these rats would perform this behavior called tail flicking. And they would tail flick when they were voluntarily approaching a predatory, I guess, a predator, predatory stimuli, fear stimuli. They're voluntarily approaching a dangerous situation. And when they tail flicked, there was a part of their brain that light up called the midline thalamus. The midline, and inside the midline thalamus is this area called the nucleus reunion. And when you tickle this part of the brain, what it does is it produces this stimuli. It's connected directly to these dopaminergic areas. Let me show you these areas here. So what you're looking at is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Mesolimbic pathway is also just called the reward pathway. It's the primary reward system that we have in our brains. And it's tied to the acquisition. It's an outward-facing reward system. It's what motivates you to move, right? To move from point A to point B, to move from here into the kitchen to get water, right? As simple as that. Or to move into the world to what? To assume an identity, to assume a future self that is desirable, that can move through the world in a way that you find satisfying. So become a doctor, become a banker, or get enough money to buy that car. It moves you forward. So it's the dopamine that you associate with that goal that propels you forward. So basically, the dopamine, the midline thalamus isn't on here, but it's connected to this area called the ventral tegmental area. Actually, let me see if it's let me put it on display here. It's connected to this area, the ventral tegmental and the nucleus accumbens. This is where most of the dopamine comes from, right? This is the dopamine pathway. And when you tickle the midline thalamus, which I think is like down here or something like that, actually I have no idea. It directly sends a signal to trigger dopamine release into I guess into your brain somewhere, I guess in the prefrontal or something like that. And what happens is you get this weird sensation where it's not particularly pleasure. It's pleasure mixed with, so it's anticipation combined with mild frustration. It's an agitated state. It's a highly aroused autonomic state. Like your system is flooded with activity. You know, it's more arousing than extreme fear. You know, it's more arousing than certainly than paralysis. But it's a highly pleasurable state because your system is so turned on. And basically, what they found is that people will work more for that feeling than they will for sexual stimuli. Like they could press different bars, and the bar that they pressed over and over again was tickling the midline thalamus. And what that is, again, it's voluntary approach in the face of fear, voluntary approach towards reward stimuli. Sorry, voluntary approach towards fear stimuli. Now the key is it has to be voluntary. What does that mean? The rats weren't just running in like, you know, just there like crazy, like madman running in towards a predator, like to a cat or something like that. What they're doing is they're carefully moving towards this fear stimuli, this thing that they're afraid of. They're cautiously moving in. They're strategic, right? Think of like, I don't know, I keep thinking of Navy SEALs, but like a Navy SEAL or like one of those Delta Rangers slowly creeping into like a terrorist hideout, something like that, you know? And this feeling is the most pleasurable, technically the most pleasurable feeling that we can have. This is what our system is trying to induce us to do the most. And so it's like, well, what's that narrative look like? Moving carefully and strategically towards fear, something that's dangerous, something that you're not sure you can handle, something that you're not even sure what it is, right? It's sort of this unknown. What does that sound like? What's that narrative look like? I don't know, maybe like the hero story? Right? I mean, just throwing it out there. I mean, what does a hero do? The hero voluntarily, right? The key is voluntary. And there are mythologies that are set up where the hero, like in this ancient Sumerian literature, in what is it? In the Enuma Elish. It's one of the oldest cosmogonies, creation stories ever told that we have on record in writing. It's roughly 7,000 years old, where Marduk, the hero, it says something like no one forced him to confront Tiamat. He did it all on his own. He did it of his own choice. It's interesting that they made a point to say that, because the deepest rewards locked within your physiology in this weird place called the nucleus reunion, the deepest rewards that you can unlock within yourself come from a voluntary action. That if you just give in to your rage, give in to your fear, right? All these involuntary things, you just fall asleep, you're hungry, you go, like, that's not unlocking the deepest rewards. The deepest reward has to be the prefrontal cortex leading your involuntary systems, right? Directing, guiding through narrative, through story. Coordinating all your systems together to move into danger. Probably with the anticipation of some kind of reward from doing that. It's like, why do people climb mountains? Why do people, I don't know if skydive is a great example. Skydive is I guess there's a skill to skydiving, but mountain climbing certainly is this long drawn out process that can be extraordinarily dangerous, especially free climbing, right? Bouldering, when they free climb. Why do people do that? Well, it's intensely pleasurable. Why? Because it's dangerous. Because it inspires fear. There's a focus that they have to have that's driven by fear, the knowledge that they could die at any moment, right? A lot of these daring physical activities, to me, is a reenactment of the hero story, which is deeply laid within our physiology. The hero story, the spiritual top-down story, this survey of all these different mythologies and cultures, telling the story over and over again of heroes entering into danger. They often actually enter into death. If you hadn't watched the part one, I mean, go watch that, or basically the hero has to confront his deepest fears, right? With the purpose of emerging as someone who can embrace their destiny. And then eventually confront the tyranny that is oppressing their people, that is destroying or enslaving the world. This is written into our biology, into our physiology. If you think about, well, what is the machine driven to do? What are we being induced to do the most? We're being induced to do the thing that gives the highest reward. I mean, almost by definition. Why would it be the highest reward if our physiology, our designed by evolution, however you want to think about it, didn't want us to do that? It wouldn't have within it such a deeply desirable reward. A reward that persists in being valuable, that does not erode over time, right? These other types of pleasurable rewards, like sexual stimuli, or, you could say, I don't know, good food, however you want to call it, palate stimuli or something like that, sensual stimuli, all these things that contain purely pleasure, intoxication, those are the main ones, right? Sex, food, drugs. I mean, those are the sort of, it could be a number of things, but if it doesn't involve fear, danger, you could construe that as a sense of pain. It's significant effort. If it doesn't contain those elements, you're not going to get that unique unlock, that extraordinarily deep unlock within your physiology to reward you for engaging in that narrative. Or you could say engaging in that identity. Because what is a person like that? How do you see a person like that? Like, how would it change if you found out that the person you were talking to, again, was a Navy SEAL? This is a guy that voluntarily enters into danger on a regular basis, right? Who undergoes probably unspeakable amounts of pain, potentially, who's probably seen unthinkable things, right? He engages in these dangerous, painful, fearful things. But that assumes that covers him or kind of drapes him with an identity. He's a hero, you could say. He's one who has coordinated his prefrontal with the rest of his physiology in such a way. He's mastered the rules, the multiple matrices of rules within the world and within himself in order to achieve a force that can contend with the evil in the world. For example, that would be like a Navy SEAL. Or this person who, I don't remember their names, but they free climb up this, right? He's able to master the elements of the world, master his physiology such that he can now perform something that's admirable. The symbolic representation of obstacle, he can overcome the obstacles of the harshness of reality. He can contend with the rules of reality and prevail. Because the world is kind of this adversary. The world is an adversary. The world's a hard place. It's trying to kill us all the time. Every day we get older. Every minute we get older. So then the hero story is this instinctive story, right? It's a preference that comes from within that's consistent across generations and across cultures. That is perceiving, it's orientating, contextualizing both the world and ourselves. And it just so happens that the way it contextualizes the world is a dangerous place. The world is a place that must be overcome in some ways in order to secure the future for the most amount of people across the most amount of time. That's what the world is. The world needs someone to save the people. And then who am I? I am the person that voluntarily moves towards the dangerous obstacles that must be overcome in order to secure the future. It's just science, man. I don't know. It's just science. You don't have to believe it's necessary. You don't have to believe everything is true. You only have to believe it's necessary. That's another good quote. You don't have to believe everything is true. You only have to believe it is necessary. It's just science, man. It's just how we're built. If you want the greatest rewards, you have to be a hero. All right. Love you guys. We're going to talk more about this in part 3, but we're going to do more versions of this lecture. I'm really excited. That was fun. That was really cool. But we'll continue to refine and make it better. And we'll get more into what it, how this hero story interacts with our physiology and what that means for us, what it means for our destiny, what it means for how we move in the world. So, all right, great.